There was once a knight whose name was known the world over. But it was not his abilities that had made him famous. Indeed, he was viewed with curiosity, not respect. Many thought him downright unsettling. It was the way in which he did battle, while most warriors took pleasure in striking their enemies and avoiding their blows. This knight was the exact opposite. Apparently, he would howl with joy whenever struck, and his face would twist with satisfaction. This is not to say that he was a novice. He was able to predict his opponent's movements, and despite encouraging them to strike him, would never allow them to land a fatal blow. This apparent insanity would baffle his enemies, who eventually became so disoriented that they would turn tail and flee. The knight didn't know when or why he had started to fight this way. All he knew was that he found receiving a blow from an enemy to be much more pleasurable than landing a blow of his own. In training and battle alike, the knight fought to get hurt. Victory and defeat were meaningless. Nevertheless, his ability to make his enemies flee the battlefield led many to believe he was invincible. Indeed, as his reputation spread, most opponents ran away as soon as they saw him. Before he had a chance to engage them in battle, such an outcome always dissatisfied the knight. With no opponents to strike him, he could not attain the pleasure he so craved. He realized he needed to do something to lure enemies into facing him, so he decided to tie himself up in chains, greatly restricting his ability to fight. Doing battle in chains caused the knight to suffer countless cuts and gashes. But this was exactly as desired. The thrill of taking himself to the brink of death was nothing but a joy. His perverse desire for pain was growing out of control. But the knight had no idea what to do about it. All he wanted was to experience more pain, more suffering. The knight acquired instruments of torture, and every night would instruct his footmen to use them on him, as his eyeballs became engorged in excruciating pain. The knight would laugh maniacally and scream at the top of his voice for more. Many of his men felt uncomfortable, even sick, torturing their master. Some of them fled, unable to contemplate executing their orders. Eventually, the constant blood loss and pain brought the knight to the brink of death, and yet he was still not satisfied. Even after torturing himself to within an inch of his life, there was only one thing the knight desired: more suffering, and more pain. As his consciousness dimmed, the knight thought to himself,
"What is behind this insatiable hunger for suffering? Where does it come from, this desire that swells up inside me? This urge I do not understand. Perhaps..."
Finally, the knight understood what was behind his perversion. The fact that his desire was stronger. The closer he got to death made it clear. And it was in fact very simple. He wanted a taste of death. Moments after he had come to this realization, the knight had a curious vision. A chalice appeared before him, glowing pure white. Soon afterwards, he heard a voice.
"If you are able to pay the price, I can satisfy your desire,"
it said. The knight used his final dregs of energy to roar his assent. He would pay any price that would bring further pleasure. The very next moment, the knight's body began to move of its own accord. His hand clasped his sword and put it to his neck. With one clean blow, the knight decapitated himself. As fresh blood burst from his severed neck, the knight's head fell to the floor. The pain, intensely exhilarating, was accompanied by the realization that he had taken the final step. Death was his. The pleasure was simply indescribable. He had scarcely dared to imagine such joy even possible. Once the initial euphoria had worn off, the knight came to a realization. Though his head was no longer attached to his body, he was not dead. His decapitation had simply allowed him to experience the pleasure of death in perpetuity. In other words, he had joined the ranks of the living dead. Having transcended life itself, he could enjoy this pleasure for eternity. His face though no longer attached to his body, broke out into a broad grin. However, his happiness was short-lived. There was an inherent problem with his desire. After all, his wish for a taste of death was nothing more than a form of intense curiosity. And curiosity can never be sated. Sure enough, the knight was soon consumed by an all-new desire. He wanted to know what was next, what awaits after death. Was death the end of all suffering? Or was there more for him to enjoy? Alas, the answer to these questions remain a mystery. Despite his intense focus on the matter, his headless form continues to roam the land, in search of someone who can make him suffer despite his undeath, someone who can satisfy his craving.